Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, it's the second film coming out of our autumn film season at the Regent Street Cinema in London. We called the season Films of Ideas. And today, the film that I'm discussing with our special guest is the unique, in many ways, inimitable, quite hard to describe, My Dinner with Andre. And I'm going to be talking about it with the playwright and screenwriter Lee Hall. We are going to be trying to decide what on earth this extraordinary film is really about. As we said last time, we're very aware with these episodes that the conversation you're about to hear took place in front of an audience in a cinema where we had all just watched the film. And I'm pretty confident that many of the people listening to this podcast not only have never seen My Dinner with Andre, but don't really know what it's about. If you have seen it, my guess is you do remember at least something of what it's about because it is extraordinarily memorable. There really isn't another film like it. But I want to say a bit for people who haven't seen it about what it is that we're discussing. And one of the things about My Dinner with Andre is it's quite hard to describe, not least because it is a pretty unlikely sounding film, an unlikely film to have become a real cult, which it is, and a film that is still much watched and much discussed because it's got a pretty unprepossessing setup. The story, and calling it a story itself is stretching that term, the story is really of two men who meet for dinner in a restaurant and talk for the best part of 2 hours. And then go their separate ways. And that's it. My Dinner with Andre is about a dinner. And there are just the two of them. They are almost the only people who speak in the film, who make any noise in the film at all. There is, as you'll hear in the discussion, a waiter who hovers in the background while they have their meal and interacts with them a little bit. But really, it's minimal. There's a little exchange when one of them arrives at the restaurant. There's a discussion with the maitre d'. It's a two-hander. It's a two-hander between two men, Wallace Shawn and Andre Gregory, played by Wallace Shawn and Andre Gregory. Wallace Shawn, usually referred to as Wally in the movie, was a youngish playwright and actor. Andre Gregory was a theatre director well known in avant-garde circles in New York and elsewhere for his very experimental theatre. That is the real Wallace Shawn, the real Andre Gregory. And those are the characters that they're playing in this film. The Wallace Shawn in the film is a young writer-actor. The Andre Gregory in the film is an avant-garde theatre director. So they are playing themselves, and yet they aren't playing themselves. This is an extremely constructed, tightly scripted piece. It's not improvised. And it was written by primarily Wallace Shawn in conjunction with Andre Gregory. They spent a long time putting this thing together, shaping it, crafting it. But it is not the case that what we are watching is a conversation between the real people, even though they are played by the real people. So that's one of the complications of this film, and that's one of the things that Lee Hall and I discussed. Just how are we meant to make sense of that? The way the film starts is that Wally Shawn, hears that his old friend, or at least professional partner, Andre Gregory, because it's clear they've done work together, is back in town and wants to have dinner with him. And he's pretty wary. He doesn't want to go to dinner with Andre because he's heard stories about Andre. Andre's been off somewhere. No one's particularly sure where, but he's been on some kind of trip in every sense of that word. Weird stories circulate around Andre Gregory. And Wally has heard that he's been seen weeping in the streets. And the thought is he's probably had some kind of nervous breakdown, and now he wants to have dinner, and he's really wary. This could be a terrible evening. What's he going to do? Is he going to start crying? Does he want to unburden himself in some way? So he's a reluctant guest at the dinner with Andre. He goes to this fancy restaurant. He doesn't look particularly comfortable in the fancy restaurant. He has to put on a tie as he walks in. Seems quite a stuffy place. Doesn't put him at his ease. Andre shows up. Andre does not look like a man who's had a nervous breakdown. He looks at ease in this restaurant. He's much more familiar with the people who run it. He's much more comfortable ordering and so on. He seems in his element and he looks lively and engaged. But Wally is still wary. You can see he's really wary. And we get a monologue at the beginning, an internal monologue from Wallace Shawn, in which he says, I'm not looking forward to this thing, but I did what I always do, which is because I was nervous and uneasy, I just asked him questions. And so he more or less says to Andre, what have you been up to? And the first part of their conversation is really dominated by Andre Gregory. He does almost all of the talking to start with, and he answers the question, what has he been doing? He tells the stories of his adventures, of his travels, and they are pretty exotic, far-fetched. They don't sound as though they're necessarily all true, and by the end they sound quite fantastical. Though actually, again, as we'll hear in the life of Andre Gregory, a lot of this stuff did happen. It starts with tales of theatre, of avant-garde theatre. He wanted to go further and further out there, do more and more radical work. And the work, which is a large part of what he describes in the first part of the film, is pretty out there. It's not clear exactly where the line between theatre ends and religious ceremony or communal consciousness-raising exercise or, frankly, orgiastic activity begins. He tells stories of theatrical events that took place in studios, but then in forests and in castles. And the connection with theatre gets looser and looser. It's not clear who these performances are for. They seem actually to be an end in themselves. These aren't rehearsals. These are just events. They get weirder and wilder. They involve simulations of death and burial. They involve all sorts of strange kinds of dancing and chanting. They happen all around the world, but then it goes beyond theatre. He's on a search for something, trips to the desert, trips up mountains, trips eventually to a small community in Scotland, in the north of Scotland, in the islands called Findhorn, part artistic, part semi-religious retreat in which he has some of his weirdest experiences. And he recounts all of this to Wally, who, to start with, looks amused and then intrigued, at various points skeptical, but encourages him. And he tells these stories charmingly and fluently, and they are fascinating. They're gripping. It's a really gripping film. If you haven't seen it, I do hope you will. It's mind-blowing. It may not sound it, trust me, it is. The stories go on, but we also see Wally get more and more involved in the conversation because he starts to push back a bit. And the conversation expands beyond Andre's experiences to some of Andre's ideas. What does this mean? What has he learned? What has he discovered? Again, as they go beyond his experiences, the conversation focuses on theatre. What have we learnt about theatre, the hollowness of theatre, the failures of contemporary theatre? Why is theatre so dead? Why are our experiences in theatre so dead? A somewhat conventional conversation, but then it broadens to what's wrong with capitalism, what's wrong with modern society, what's wrong with modernity. What is the relationship between modernity, science, and religion, faith, superstition, and indeed some of these more or less paranormal experiences that Andre may or may not have had, some of which sound, frankly, like acid trips? What is the relationship between all of this, which probably turns on the theme that becomes the theme of Andre's conversation, which is the need for means of escape that human beings, and we're talking here about the early 1980s, human beings in that stage of modernity are trapped in different ways, including in New York. Escape from New York is one of the themes. There's a kind of imprisoning of the mind, of the soul, of the body that has to be escaped from. And Wally is skeptical. He's not completely skeptical, but he pushes back. He's wary of the thought that actually this is just a kind of luxury. And it should be said that these two men are not hard up in any sense. So Wallace, the real Wallace Shawn, was the son of a man who had been editor of the New Yorker. He was very well connected. He wasn't necessarily, and in this film he's portrayed as not particularly well off, but he's connected in New York art circles for sure. He's a well-known guy. And if you see the film, he will look very familiar to you. He's been in lots of movies since. He's had a very successful career. Also, his voice will be very familiar to you because, among many other things, he is the voice of Rex the dinosaur in the Toy Story films. Andre was born into considerable wealth. And actually, in many ways, you can see Wally thinking that his friend may or may not be a kind of dilettante. there's some privilege to what he's describing. The ability to go off and do these things, have these adventures. So he's wary, but he's also wary of the arguments. And there is some pushback, but as you'll hear in my discussion with Lee Hall, it's not completely clear where this ends. Who gets the better of the arguments? Has someone won the argument? Has someone changed their mind in the course of this discussion? This is one of the questions that the film raises. It ends with them going their separate ways. We don't know what Andre thought of the dinner. We're not told. We're never taken inside Andre's head. We only have Andre speaking his words to Wally. We hear Wally's thoughts before and after the dinner. After the dinner, he goes back and tells his girlfriend about it and also reflects on his childhood in New York. So one of the questions is, well, it's a question throughout the film, who are these people and what do they actually think? A little bit more about Lee Hall, with whom I'm discussing this film. Lee Hall is a very significant playwright, screenwriter across a whole range of different forms in which it's possible to pursue those activities, from his earliest success, which was a radio play originally, Spoonface Steinberg, to his, I mean, even the word mega doesn't do it justice, mega success, the film Billy Elliot, that then became the musical, Billy Elliot, the musical, to, among many other things that he's done subsequently, being the screenwriter for the Elton John biopic, Rocketman. As you will hear in this conversation, Lee Hall, early in his career, was very interested, still is very interested in New York avant-garde theatre and some of the ideas, some of the people who influenced avant-garde theatre, European thought that made its way to the United States. And as a young, aspiring playwright, he hung out in that world a bit, during which time he met Andre Gregory. So one of the things that we're going to hear about in this conversation is Lee's experience of hearing Andre Gregory talk. So Lee is talking about this as someone who loves this film, as I do, and is interested in the ideas in it, but also knows the people involved. So this is a conversation about the ideas. It's also a conversation about the people. Who are they? One more thing before we get on to the conversation. We had a little difficulty with our recording equipment for this episode. All the other ones are fine. With this one, we've done what we can to tidy it up, but the sound isn't quite as good as we would like. Do please bear with us. Do please bear with it. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Lee, that film is about a lot of different things, but one thing it is clearly about, it's a film about theatre. And one of the figures who hovers in the background of this film is someone I knew nothing about before I saw this film, the Polish director Jerzy Grotowski. He gets mentioned quite a lot. He and Andre Gregory, they did this stuff, right? Gregory is talking about theatre, the beehive that he describes, going into a forest in Poland and doing that stuff. That is for real.
Well, famously, Grotowski, who was the sort of doyen of a kind of physical theatre, this was pretty extreme, and he was really influential in the sort of European avant-garde and then in America, probably because of Andre Gregory. So one of the things that they started doing was to rehearse plays over an enormous amount of time. And because they weren't doing it for money, it wasn't a kind of professional theatre. They were doing it because it was a vocation. And he trained a bit in the Moscow Arts Theatre. And Stanislavski famously developed this technique where they would do Chekhov plays for years before they put them on. And so that was very different from the American commercial theatre. And a lot of the things that they were doing was kind of excavating yourself and your life. The whole idea of the method is to make that the material of the work. And it was a pretty easy step to forgo the making of the play, and the process of doing this work, as they called it, became the work. So you yourself was the work. And I think it's a quite a familiar thing in what they call experimental theatre, that's the core of the practice. And so the process becomes the point.
Because I wanted to ask, what is the difference between what they were talking about and, say, the method? Is it that it's just more extreme? Or is it going beyond the excavating of the self to the annihilation of the self? Because some of the stuff, and I don't know how much of the full range of things he talks about is for real, but the Findhorn community really exists. Some of the kinds of theatre, non-theatre that he was describing really happened. But so, for instance, the 9 of them doing the kind of death ritual thing, I mean, that seems to go beyond anything that would pass as method theatre into something that's closer to mystical religion.
Well, the two are really interlinked, and that is something that was a Grotowski, that whole running through the woods and doing that thing and creating rituals was quite a big thing. He called it para-theatrical things. He gave up making plays, in a sense. And almost Andre Gregory gave up making plays. They did. I met Andre Gregory once.
When did you meet him?
It was probably about 1991,
So
92.
this film is 1981, I think. So about 10 years.
So it's about
after
10
this.
years later. And because I lived in New York, and my girlfriend at the time was a friend of Andre Gregory's, and he invited us to go whitewater rafting in North Carolina.
As you do.
As you do. And we got there, and the weather was too bad, so we didn't go whitewater rafting. We sat in a hotel, and he talked like that for 2 days. And it was incredible because his massive gift is being a storyteller. And all of these things are true. But I think there's a strain in theatre makers at that time that was very in touch with people like Gurdjieff and this idea that we're all asleep and we need to wake up, and that there are various spiritual austerities that we have to do and mortifications coming from these Eastern traditions, was something that was kind of being used by a lot of theatre makers, especially in the 60s. And Grotowski and Peter Brook were looking at a lot of things. And there's this guy, Antonato, who was very influential on them all. And he used to say that the sort of ideal is that an actor immolates themselves and signals through the flames. But
not literally, because with these guys, you feel like...
But it was putting the actor in such physical extremis. And famously, Peter Brook did a lot of experiments around this in the 60s. So there is a strain of theatre practice that's always straining to bring life and the acute somatic experience of the actor, as the participant in this thing, trying to use it as the material for making theatre.
It seems to me one of the really interesting things about this film is the ways in which it isn't dated and the ways in which it is dated. Some of it, you watch it and you just feel like these people could be having this conversation now. And some of it feels very of its time. So when there's a point, I think it's about 2/3 of the way through, where they start to have an argument about realism in theatre. And some of it feels like this argument just must happen all the time. People will be saying this now. So at one point, he kind of says, I think it's Wallace Shawn, I actually can't remember which of them it says it doesn't really matter, because they agree on this. A few years ago, people cared enough about the theatre to say it was dead. And now everyone's such a phony and such a fake. They go and see these terrible plays and they say, darling, you were wonderful. And isn't everybody fake? Aren't these theatre parties fake? How do you wake our audience up? Everyone is so asleep. They're robots. They're living these sort of TV fantasy lives. They're in a dream world. It feels very now. People could be having those arguments now. And I imagine in theatre, everyone has always said 5 years ago they cared enough to say it's dead, and now they don't even care enough for that. And yet some of what is being described here feels like it's come out of the 60s and the 70s, and it isn't happening now. I mean, some of what they're talking about, the extreme lengths to which they were willing to go, some of the extreme psychedelic mysticism of this is not something that feels to me kind of familiar in 2025. Is that how it strikes you? It's almost like there are these two things going on, one of which is cyclical. It's just people are always having that argument about how do you wake people up in a modern world where they've been desensitized. And through the 60s to the 70s to the early 80s, but not that far beyond, people were doing that stuff.
Well, I think not enough people are doing that stuff. I have a theory. when Andrew Gregory was starting to make theatre, it was sort of in the mid-50s and the 60s. He went to the Berlin Ensemble and had met Grotowski, and then he tried to go and see Grotowski, and he went all the way to Poland, but he wasn't there. He was at the Edinburgh Festival. So Andrew Gregory went to the Edinburgh Festival, and that there was a kind of an experiment that I think was happening not just in theatre makers, all sorts of artists and all sorts of people were seeking some other way to live their lives. And what happened was that Andrew Gregory really struggled to find his work. And then in 1970, he took some students for NYU and made this play of Alice in Wonderland. And it was an absolute sensation. And at the time, there was Peter Brook did the same with Midsummer Night's Dream. And they were sort of the most celebrated pieces of work of their era. And Andrew Gregory toured around the world for 4 years and was the doyen of experimental theatre. And he came back to New York, and the troupe fell apart because how do you follow that? They were doing it for no real money. It just collapsed, but it collapsed in 74, 75. Which is when New York was collapsing. And New York famously went bankrupt, and Gerald Ford was not going to bail them out. And so it was the start, and I think a lot of people, you know much more about this than me, it was the start of a neoliberal project to create austerity in New York. And they did that. And so there was this feeling in these years where Andrew Gregory was falling apart and doing this seeking that the whole of New York was becoming dysfunctional. And so the familiar bits, I think, are the first people to start experiencing this version of modernity, which we've been living in. Since then, this neoliberal era was being experimented on in New York. And I think that the disaffection, the ennui, the sense of personal crisis, the sense of your own jailer, that guy, Bong Chul-han, who writes about all of this. It seems that all of those things are the things that Wally and Andre are talking about.
And yet it's also a film that is haunted by the Holocaust. So the thing that runs all the way through it, it just comes up in all sorts of different places and settings. When he's talking about his mother in the hospital, he says she looks like she came out of Auschwitz or Dachau. When he goes to the flag maker is this Aryan blonde guy, and he puts a Tibetan swastika on the flag. Right at the beginning, there's this haunting line, the very first exchange they have when Wallace Shawn kind of says, "What have you been up to? Give me an example." And he says, "Well, Grotowski said to me, 'What do you want to make theatre?' And so he gives him this ridiculous set of demands, which is find me 40 Jewish women and this and that and a harp and this and that." And Grotowski comes back and kind of says, "Well, I can do all of that, but not the Jewish women. That's harder to find because we're talking about Poland." And so this is also, it's a film that sort of projects forward to a kind of alienated in the 21st century. We can feel it's visionary in its account of an alienated world. But actually, what it's mainly about is the line between civilization and barbarism that is exemplified by the Nazis. Apart from anything else, it is a deeply Jewish film.
Yes, and Andrew Gregory had this extraordinary background. His dad, it's very mysterious, and even to Andre, where his money came from. But he used to work with Trotsky just after the revolution, then somehow went to France and made some deal that Ribbentrop used to turn up in France in the early 30s and be doing business with Andre's dad. Anyway, they came to New York with a hell of a lot of money, and they lived this incredible life. Somehow he had enough money to buy Brentwood Country Club in LA. And Andre says that he sold it for not enough money, but they used to rent Thomas Mann's house for the summers. And they used to go from New York to LA. And he would hang out with, Albert and Costello and the Marx Brothers and Marlene Dietrich, and Toscanini was there. And his mother was having an affair with Errol Flynn. And he had this amazing kind of very, very privileged life. And they just had so much money. But they didn't tell Andre he was Jewish until he was in his teens. And he was always shocked by this. And the father was a terrible alcoholic. And he had this very, very cold and upsetting childhood where obviously they closed it down and were trying to behave like, rich wasps. And so he wrote a memoir. And so much of this is about his trying to deal with this terrible, emotionally alienated childhood. Whereas Wally Shawn, his father, came from quite a lower middle class family, but his dad ended up being the editor of The New Yorker for about 35 years, and its sort of heyday in the mid-century. Well, you can tell his father took him to buy suits and, have ice cream after school and live this very, very warm world. And so I think that the transgenerational trauma, I think, is the motivating problem for Andre. And certainly in his book, he says it's much more about that familial trauma. But also, Louis Malle was partly Jewish, brought up a Catholic, but famously, he saw at school a teacher and some kids that got taken out of his school and sent to Auschwitz, and he made a film about it, Au revoir les enfants.
And Grotowski was Jewish as well?
He was Jewish, and he had to hide from the Nazis in this little village in Poland. So there's this huge trauma and this whole sense that right until the end of his life that Andre Gregory's father would be saying, should we get out now? So there's this sense of precariousness was very, very present. And I think
in that little speech where he talks about New York and he says he's met this Swedish physicist, or he's meeting all these people who says, I've seen it for what it is. It's this kind of prison camp in which the prisoners are the guards. They've constructed the camp for themselves, and like you say, it feels sort of future oriented. It's like this vision of a city that's become, as he would say, a sort of part of the international capitalist conspiracy to keep the people down. But the way he frames the question about whether and how to get out is it's like being a Jew in Germany in the 1930s. And actually, that for him, the question about getting out of New York, and maybe that comes from his father, is this thought that history is repeating itself rather than that we've crossed the threshold into the future. Actually, all of this is about that familiar experience where the line between civilization and barbarism is thinner than you think, and it's not medieval. It happened 40 years ago.
Well, even the waiter was a guy who left France in the 30s. I don't know if he was Jewish or not, but he was a film distributor, and he set up an art house cinema in New York, and then became the head of the technical bit of films in MoMA. And so he had this, to sort of put him as the waiter was, I think, speaks of all this.
I want to ask you a bit more about the waiter, but I want to ask a different kind of question, which is just be interesting to hear what people think, especially people who've never seen the film before, which is, why does it work? Because on paper, this is not a promising setup for a film. Not just these two men talking, not just the fact that it sort of happens in real time and nothing actually happens, but what they talk about. Some of the stories that Andre tells are ridiculous, and some of them are quite samey as well. He goes into real detail into his mystical experiences, the stuff about the Buddhist monk and all of that. Laid out on the page, my guess is you would be surprised to discover that this is one of the iconic films in the history of cinema, and it's had this extraordinary afterlife. It's revered by so many people. But when you were watching it now here, as someone who writes films, writes plays, some extremely successful films that are watched by many, many people, but you look at that one, why does it work? I mean, how does it work? Where's the magic?
Of course I'm going to say that, but Wally's writing is absolutely brilliant. There is nothing at all that is accidental in the entire film.
Just to be clear, none of that was improvised.
No. It took Andre Gregory 9 months to learn. So what happened was, it's all a confection, the whole thing about the restaurant. That is just, I think, a setting to make the point of their privilege. They would never go to that restaurant. It's setting up the problem of their privilege to be the subject matter of the piece. Wally Shawn had got obsessed with Alice and would go every night, and then they got kind of friendly. And they did one play before Andre went on his craziness. But when he came back, he got in touch with Andre, and they spent a lot of time, like maybe a year, where they got a grant and they would sit in a room in NYU and we would record all of these stories. Because this is just the tip of the iceberg of the madness. And then Wally went away for a year and edited it all down. So it's all kind of what Andre said, but he kind of molded it and wrote it. And apparently it was 3 hours long when they gave it to Louis Malle. And Louis took an hour out. But I saw an interview with Wally Shawn who said, that every single line was fought over. And then even when they did it, he took half an hour out of the finished movie. But Wally said he was just horrible to Louis Malle because in his view, every word and every sentence had 4 or 5 different purposes and meanings. And I think that's why it works, because it's absolutely highly wrought. And I think it's very sort of Chekhovian that he has these long passages from Andre Gregory, and then there'll be some little funny comment, and that's exactly Chekhov's method. But I think that's why I think they, of course, went on to do Uncle Vanya as their next project. But it is this sense of them feeling of they're sitting on some huge thing that's about to happen, that this troubling Chekhovian tectonic change is about to happen. But I think it works because it's full of ideas. I think also because Wally Shawn's a classicist, he says he's a Latin teacher. I think
people treated him like a dog.
Yeah, but I think there's so many allusions and models that he's using that obviously the symposium that is part of that. And even in Plato's Symposium, it's a report of a dinner that happened to somebody that they heard. It's kind of Plato's mythology of how to tell the story, that it's all in Wally's work. So I think it's highly wrought as a piece of writing.
So as someone who perhaps uniquely, certainly in this room, has seen both I think that's 110 minutes, but also had the full weekend version. So like if he talked to you for 48 hours, because that's pretty intense, but also it's quite long actually for a film. That is a lot of talking. What was the difference between 48 hours of Andre and 110 minutes? Do the stories get repetitive or is it even wilder?
Well, apparently Louis Malle gave him one acting note, which was speak much faster. And I think that weirdly, it looks very natural, but it's not natural at all. It's highly, highly crafted as a piece of filmmaking. And all the little bits of exactly when the waiter's in the background and everything. It's very, very wrought film, and it couldn't work if it wasn't so carefully thought through. I think the thing is that the genius of Wally Shawn realized that Andre's life was his art. And he's this incredible talker. And each one of the stories has 5 other stories connected to it, which are just as interesting. And somehow he whittled it down to this thing. But it's this strange loop of Andre being the story, but it's really the story of Wally. It's the story of the effect of meeting somebody. And so Wally Shawn says that it was almost a way of exercising a persona that Wally had. He wanted to write out this frightened, conservative person because as wild as it is, that's the charm. And we know, yes, and you see Wally go to pieces when he tries to justify at the end the quotidian, and it's got to be important. But we can see that he's not convinced. And they don't have an answer, really. The answer is a new language of love and those things. But it's asking a lot of questions, and it's asking them this deft dance between these two people who are highly intelligent, and it's highly elusive about all sorts of things.
I read somewhere that one of the things that annoyed Wallace Shawn about this movie is people just assumed they were playing themselves. And he wanted to say, this is art, this is not life, it's not realism, it's not passing around the head that we've got from the morgue. This is highly wrought art, as you say. And he thought maybe what they should have done is played each other. So actually, Wally should have played Andre, and Andre should have played Wally. And as I was watching it, I was trying to imagine that. And I have to say, I couldn't get there. So, when I see Wallace Shawn, I think of Rex in Toy Story, the voice, apart from anything else. Can you conceive it? It would be fascinating to see it, but could they conceivably have played each other and this film worked?
I can't imagine it either. I mean, they're so sort of physically different and temperamentally. I think what's absolutely lovely that they were a distillation of versions of themselves, obviously. And it must have been I'm not sure how often people do play themselves in movies. But I think it is this strange loop, and it was coming from a cauldron of downtown art, especially in the theatre scene, that people were starting to use that. So at the same time as Andre Gregory had his Manhattan Theatre Group, the Worcester Group came out of a teacher at NYU who was doing the same thing. And so the guy Spalding Gray were making up pieces of work based on Spalding. And then very soon after this, he started doing monologues about himself, and probably inspired by the success of, but they're all part of this same world. And so there was definitely a move, certainly in the late 70s and early 80s, to use your life and the quotidian of your life as your theatre pieces. And so it's also of its time. They talk about if they'll do another one, but I can't imagine what
now.
it would be.
Andre Gregory's still alive, I think. Right?
Yeah, he's 91. They're 10 years apart. But they famously said at the time they would do another one when they got to 90 and only talk about sex.
I want to ask you something about the structure of it. So it is, as you say, it's full of ideas and they interweave with each other and they bounce off with each other. But it felt to me watching it just now that it's got this shape where there are various points in the film where they come together and they are agreeing. But the things that they agree about are banal, essentially. It's like two men having a midlife crisis. When they agree that New York is shitty and no one can be trusted, and they go to parties and people are fake. That bit where he sort of says, and I went to the theatre and 8 people said I look great, and this one, and I think Wallace Shawn says, yeah, I totally know what you mean. They come together around these sort of banal, familiar, middle-aged men experiences about life and relationships and all of that. And at other points, they're miles apart. One of them is essentially a rationalist, and one of them is a kind of mystic. One of them is talking about science as something that you can rely on, and the other one is talking about science as the enemy. And they even start miles apart because the Wallace Shawn of the film is dreading the dinner, right? He's arriving, he tells us, he's heard this guy's been seen weeping the night before, he avoided him for years, he's genuinely afraid. They start miles apart. In a way, they end a long way apart, but they come together around I don't know if it's the quotidian, but it's sort of the shared experiences are the superficial ones, but still the familiar ones, the ones that we can all recognize. The relatable bits of the film are the bits where they agree, but the interesting bits of the film are the bits where they don't agree. And it's like modeling a certain kind of conversation. It's an inspiring conversation, not least because of the ways in which they allow the other one to say their piece. But they are, on the important stuff, they are miles apart, or not.
Well, it depends on where you see, because I don't
Depends on what the important stuff is.
No, but it's where the film finishes. Because
Right.
I think that I think it is a big loop, because I think that Wally is undone by the conversation. He has to go back and tell. I don't think he went back to Debbie and said, "Oh, I wish I hadn't have gone there." I think that there's an implication that he's gone away to think about this because he's seen the importance of when he drives back in the cab and each building is. So I think it's much more dialectical than what you're suggesting. And I think that Wally changed his life after he wrote it, because I think there's another sort of polarity between what I might characterize as a liberal and a socialist. And Wally really became much more publicly identified as a socialist. I mean, he wrote Why I Am a Socialist. After this. I think he'd always been quite interested. But so I think that there's this weird coming together, because certainly it seems to me that they are moving around each other, but actually are coming to agree. I think that all of Wally's objections are kind of admitted by Andre. And it just feels that Wally's protestations at the very end are clearly he's uncomfortable. So I kind of feel that he's painting Andre as a shaman, and that wounded person who, the shaman figure and the transformational point of it. I think he's giving Andre his character. He's painting a shaman, about somebody who was seeking the sacramental and the miraculous. And however ridiculous that is, and it's all smoke and mirrors, it is transformative. And I think that's why it's so compelling, because it is a portrait of a shaman. And Wally's saying, I think that that's important.
Did he give up his electric blanket?
I don't.
So there's a sort of pivotal moment, I guess, 15 minutes from the end, where the most nonsense story of all that Andre tells is about the roof in Scotland. I mean, it's just bollocks. And Wally Shawn says, so for most of the points up until that point, he's expressed his skepticism with a kind of wry, accepting humor. And at that point, he is mocking, and he just goes, and people laughed, and as he just goes, yeah, that's his limit. He reaches his limit. But you're right, after that, again, and it's deeply moving at the end. I mean, the other thing is it's very moving at the end when the music kicks in, and you think, why am I so moved? But that last bit, quite close to the end, they are a long way apart. I feel like he can't go with him down the path to the nonsense, because a lot of it is nonsense. And yet something about it has changed him, as you say.
I think so. And I think that it's quite skillfully drawn that Andre is not satisfied with his, these crazy things. And
he's disgusted by himself in many ways.
Yeah. So I think that Andre is really questioning himself and isn't happy. But I think you get that Wally isn't very happy either. And so there are these two guys who are meeting. And I think this Martin Buber thing, that seeing the other and allowing the other, which is central to all that stuff about Hasidism and the idea of the prayer, but that space between each other is really central to, I think, what Andre Gregory is saying and what the movie is doing. And that thing about the fortune cookie, and you're going to have a really life-changing meal with a dark-haired man. The irony of that is that he is, and that's what's happened to him. And that's why I think he's shook up by the fortune cookie analogy that he's brought up from his unconscious. And of course, this is all written and thought about and fought about, every single bit. It's a drama. It looks like it's cinema verite, but it's not. It's a drama. And that's why I think it's Chekhovian in the way that it's very hard to get your hands on, and it's very melancholic, and it's full of ideas, and it's full of emotions, but it doesn't resolve in a typical way because it's probing.
Were psychedelics involved in this form of theatre? Because there are bits, so at various points he's describing having bad trips. That's what he's doing. I mean, the bits where he's in the car and he sees himself in the mirror and there are birds coming out of his mouth, and he's on the plane and there's a beast, and he's in the church and there's another beast, and so on. I mean, a lot of that comes out of a culture which was very open to psychedelics.
I would imagine there's a lot of, there would have been.
Because it's hard to imagine Wally Shawn on acid.
Yeah,
we don't know,
right? I would love to see Wally Shawn on acid, but I have no idea. But I think even when they weren't using drugs, they were trying to get to a different plane. And that was almost the point of doing a lot of the exercises and things that they would do in the theater. But I think there were a lot of casualties because it's the 70s. It's New York's going bankrupt, Nixon, the end of the 60s, that anxiety that's in Network in New York at the same time. The woman in Network, Diane, she's been an acid casualty, and now she's going to come and sort out television where she's got cleaned up. So there is that sense of burnout that a lot of people were feeling at the same time.
So one more question, which is about the waiter, because he's a really important part of this film. He frames it at various points, just the looks that he gives them at various points, but also at parts of the conversation, they're talking about essentially bad faith. They're talking about people playing roles that they cannot be themselves in, and whether it's a father or a mother or a lover or whatever it is. And then it's that more general sort of midlifey angst thing that we're all fake and everyone's fake and everyone in theatre is particularly fake. You know, the parties that we go to are full of fake people. So when Sartre wrote about bad faith, the example that he gave was the waiter in the brasserie who kind of is inhabiting the role but can't fully be himself. And yet in this film, the waiter feels like the authentic person. And that bit at the end when he's smoking, you get this sort of glimpse of someone who has a life. And it feels like he's a rebuke to them. Did you get that at various points? He's like he's another version of what it is to be human, not the bad faith version, actually. He's dignified and he's elderly, and he makes them look a little ridiculous.
Yeah, and I think that seemed to be very deliberate, and they struggled to cast the waiter. And I'm not sure if it was Louis Malle, or somebody said, oh, but there's this guy who works at MoMA. He's about 75. Apparently, you know, I mean, he's a sort of almost aristocrat, and he'd never done any waiting at all. So they had to give him, they had to teach him how to do it. But I think that face and that sense of him going, because it really is about the problem of privilege and the punishment of luxury. And that what's interesting with Gregory, because he was so rich, he could just go all over the world, and the wife and kids would stay at home. And there's this whole thing about the women and what the hell, the gender politics of the whole thing.
Yeah, which has not aged particularly well.
No, but I think that they were, in their way, acknowledging it. I think they're sending themselves up a lot. I think it is a comedy. And so it's more knowing than you might think if you just see it as a fly on the wall.
So, for instance, the bit where he says one of the young women I think it was in the forest in Poland, or one of them wrote to me this long letter in which she said, you dominated me, but then she crossed it out and wrote, you tamed me. And then that becomes the way into the story about the coincidence of the Minotaur magazine and so on. But it's a bit creepy. Is it knowingly, self-consciously creepy?
I think it has to be. I mean, because there's clearly that line where he says, you know, it's very difficult being a writer, you know, and, you know, my girlfriend, Debbie, she has to go out to work to, you know.
I get Wallace Shawn is definitely, and he's sending himself up right at the beginning where he says, I've had a difficult day. You know, I got up and I did these 3 things and it was 5 o'clock. But is Andre sending himself up when he talks about the women?
I think Wally might be sending Andre up.
I suppose my question builds on that. I was interested in how you interpreted the hypocrisies in the film, because it feels like hypocrisy can often be a sort of very harsh authorial statement, and Andre exhibits a lot of hypocrisy. He's in this really posh restaurant and he's talking about sort of giving up comfort blankets. A lot of the comedy in his character comes from that he's talking about people having false conversations and being very assured, and he's saying all these mad things in a very assured way. And he's also talking about performatism and about trying to be authentic, but he's looking into a camera. Do you think all of that is just comedy and is them sort of showing themselves up? Or should we try and take that more seriously? Do you think the hypocrisy is something we should take seriously?
I think it's what it's about. It feels to me that's precisely what they were wanting to explore by making it. I mean, yeah, I do. I think that whole idea of the dinner and setting it in the Café des Artistes and all of that stuff with the waiter, that's all their invention. And I think it could only be to put a spotlight on the problem of how you live with privilege, that you can't not be. We are hypocritical, and because of the very nature of capitalism in our lives, and even having an electric blanket is problematic, and all of those things. So I do think that that's deliberate.
Wallace Shawn tries to give that defense of a way of living, which is, and I love the way it's a cup of cold coffee. I didn't know people drank cold. I didn't know they left a cup of coffee out overnight. And the joy of it is there isn't a cockroach in it. You know, it's at one end of privilege. It's not flying to Tibet and living with a Buddhist monk. It's an electric blanket and coffee cake. The coffee cake line, life can be justified by the pleasure that one gets in eating a piece of coffee cake, which is a banal line, but it's not an empty line. I mean, there's some truth in that too.
But weirdly, that's precisely the Gurdjieffian thing of waking up and seeing your environment around it. So it's the same thing as that Andre Gregory's exploring in a different way.
So you can go to Tibet, or you can do it by waking up and finding a cold cup of coffee that doesn't have a cockroach in it.
I think so, and that's the sort of I do think they say the same thing, but they're saying different aspects of the same thing.
And in a way, is this film is one of the things, I don't want to say is one of the things it's saying, because it's not really saying anything like that, but it's about these extraordinary journeys that Andre has taken. Wallace Shawn hasn't been anywhere, we're meant to believe from this. It's a cup of coffee and a piece of coffee cake. The other one, it's sort of to the moon and back. But it doesn't matter, because when they're talking about it, we're on the two journeys with them. I mean, in a way, because it's a conversation, whether you actually went to Tibet or it all happens in a restaurant in New York is irrelevant. This is about the fact that the story is the story.
Yeah, I think it's problematic going away, and it's problematic staying at home. I mean, that's the dilemma and the hypocrisies that are involved with justifying that are the stuff of the film, I think.
Not least because going away involves leaving his wife and children to
indeed
fend for themselves on his millions.
I actually didn't know they were playing themselves ignorantly. So I was curious what you, as you know, Andrew Gregory, what you think his reaction was to the film and how it portrays him later and over the years, I guess.
Well, it was a complete failure when it came out. And I think it was quite devastating because they spent quite a lot of time, and he did portray himself and tell all his best stories. But then it had, I think Siskel and Ebert saw it and gave it 2 thumbs up.
I think Ebert said it was the best film
really?
of 1981.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And then there were cinemas like this around America that started showing it, and then it became this cult thing. And it's so unique, and I think it's because it's so multifaceted, really. It's very hard to get your hand on what it is and what's going on. And there is this miraculous thing. It should be the most boring film in the world, but largely it's incredibly compelling. And it's this weird loop that they're playing themselves, but they're not themselves, but they were them. I mean, it's such a strange, miraculous thing to exist, and nobody's really done anything like it since. And so it really will be his legacy, because it is his life, and it is this wonderful portrait of him that he did himself. It's a self-portrait written by somebody else.
And the title has also entered the language. So that recent parody that Larry David wrote so the comedian and talk show guy Bill Maher went to meet Trump and wrote a thing saying, actually, he's a nice guy. And Larry David wrote a parody called My Dinner with Adolf, which is, in a weird way, referencing this.
I wonder if you could talk a bit more about the structure of it. So I hadn't seen this film before, and for about the first half, it was just an absolute horror that these men aren't actually ever going to communicate and talk to each other. And you start with just the narration of Wallace, and then he's narrating over the initial conversation. Then you've just got Gregory talking with no reaction other than the kind of one words. And then the kind of relief and triumph for me was like, oh my gosh, they've actually started to have a conversation. And the way that kind of toys with you, it almost felt like watching something very suspenseful, because I was just horrified. I
mean, was part of it a kind of social embarrassment? I mean, like, you're watching people behave badly.
Yeah, it was so absurd. And the way they start kind of talking about that, he goes, oh, I had this conversation with someone, and all he did was say stories and talk about his mother, and then he says, man, my mother, and my mother, and my mother. And yeah, it just completely toyed with me and horrified me for part of it until they really did start connecting in some way. So I just wondered if you could talk about that a bit more.
Did you think is it a suspenseful film for you?
I think it must be incredibly deliberate, because there's 50 minutes go by before we really hear anything from Wally Shawn. But I think it's also a portrait of a narcissist, and there's sort of little things like at the beginning that he mentions crying when he's gone to see Autumn Sonata, and, that being a film about a narcissist. And it's kind of, there's lots of clues about how to read this thing. And And that's one of the other structuring things, that you have this extrovert, narcissistic guy and this introvert who's sort of, it doesn't even want to be there. And this guy's gone on for an hour without stopping. And so I think it is part of the human comedy of the writing, I think. And Wally's so wound up to say something, but he gets less and less articulate as he goes on. The first couple of his interjections are really, really smart and on the ball, blah, blah, blah. And then he gets less and less clear. And in the end, he starts saying, well, I just don't even know how to say this, even how to talk about this. I think it is very deliberately written and structured. And because it doesn't have a cathartic moment in it, really. And that's one of the lovely things about it, I think, that nobody wins.
I mean, I did find myself thinking, because it's true, one talks and the other one doesn't. And so much conversation is people taking it in turns to tell their stories. And actually, I was almost charmed to start with by the fact that the Wallace Shawn character is so polite, that he's willing, he hears this story and then his interjection is, tell me another story. And you think, well, that's quaint. No one does that now, because everyone says, it's my turn to tell my story now. And so for me, actually, I was sort of charmed by his politeness, and maybe it's a sort of generational thing, but he just seemed so willing to let this ball go on until he couldn't let it go on anymore. But for the first hour, part of it for me was actually like he was conscious that the social requirement was to be polite.
I think he really believes in politeness. And famously, his father, how he ran the New Yorker, the previous guy Hal Ross, who invented the Yorker, was kind of shouting at everybody and blah, blah, blah. He made the whole thing up. But apparently, William Shawn would come to the office and not say very much and let these fantastic writers like Harand and J.D. Salinger, Joseph Mitchell, all these people kind of just do their own thing. And so I think that it is a kind of legacy, something he had inherited from his father. But I think that that's what's really lovely about Wally. And I have to say about the sort of prescience of the film, that there's this play he did called The Designated Mourner, which was probably about 95, 96. I think they did it at the National Theatre. And it is about the encroachment of fascism in America. I've been thinking about it a lot, because obviously thinking I'm going to do this, but I remember seeing that play and thinking, what nonsense. Why are these liberals in America worried about and it talks about exactly what's happened in the last 6 months in America. So I think that his political antennae is really extraordinary.
So in a way, My Dinner with Adolf is actually appropriate.
Yeah.
It's not really a question, more thought about, what aged and what didn't. I was really captivated by the mention of robots. Anyway, not really a question.
Yeah, but I was also struck, the robot line twice. It really does stand out, doesn't it? You kind of find yourself thinking, wow, you guys already knew that we were going to be robots? And we are.
You mentioned what's happened in America in the past 6 months. And I thought, as when you were discussing elements that had aged well from this film, the discussion of the divide between the sort of desensitized routine method of life and those who want to be like experiencing real things, it did make me think of a man who was shaped by the New York that they discuss, which is Donald Trump. And more specifically, which side of that divide you think he might fall on, if either? Is he the ultimate example of desensitization in life because the most powerful man in the world can go to the council of all the other countries and say that Europe is going to hell, and everyone's like, well, that was quite a normal speech by the president? Or is it the ultimate sort of kick against this routine life because all the people who can't go to Everest, like Andre can, are desperately seeking something that will almost shake up their own lives and create that sort of thrill? And Donald Trump is an imperfect vessel through which to do that. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
I think the bits in the film that they were worried about Marcuse's one-dimensional man, rather than thinking, I don't know Marcuse that so well, but that there might be a return of this repressed, which is what's happening. But I think it's a kind of plea for art And although they constantly worry about art, I think it's a plea for the civilizing aspects of what art can do and making your life art and giving expression to some reality. Because if you don't, the fascists, and they talk about, he's worried about using science, using rhetoric, using even spiritual shamanic acts, about how that can manipulate people. And so I think the melancholy was because Trump is coming, if you like, if you're reading it backwards. And they felt that. They didn't quite know what it was, but they could probably go out their house and see something going up that they would discover was put up by Trump. And so I think why the film's really interesting, apart from all of that, is that I think it's a historical document about something that's, and the Designated Mourner is very much like that. It's that art is very artists are very precarious, and it can be snuffed out. And I think they were feeling, and that's what they're saying about the theatre, they were feeling that this important thing that could be transformational, that can be sacramental, was falling apart all around them. And I think it was part of that same thing. And so what the film is about is making a plea for art and its civilizing effect on life.
And on the question, which side of the line, I think what Andre is saying at various points is the line is a very, very thin one. And so there's the bit where he's talking about how amazing the stuff was with the beehive and in the forest. And it also reminded him a bit of a Nuremberg rally. It's a very, very fine line. Tomorrow, we have a bonus episode coming out in our Films of Ideas series. This is not one of the ones that we recorded at the Regent Street Cinema, but we thought in this Christmas season, given, frankly, none of the other films are remotely Christmassy, we should do one traditional Christmas movie. And you may be surprised to hear that the movie that we have chosen is one that is stuffed full of really interesting ideas, including compatibilism, existentialism, the political theory of non-domination. I'm going to be talking to the historian of film, but as you'll hear, he has many other strings to his bow, Harrison Whitaker, about the movie It's a Wonderful Life. Here's a clip.
I mentioned to you before that this film came out in the same year that Sartre published Existentialism is a Humanism, which is the most accessible, perhaps again the most vulgar form of existentialism he offered to the public. But in it, he has the famous existence precedes essence line, which, again, to take in the most workaday sense, I think this film is really invested in as an idea. Insofar as, for George, essence precedes existence. He has already, early in the film, he has made up what his life is supposed to be. It's supposed to be a life of travel, of success, of ideas that are inherent to his living a good life, and that those two things cannot be unwedded. Fast forward to Clarence showing him that actually existence is the only thing, and meaning comes thereafter. And if you take away existence, which of course, the most famous aspect of the film, Clarence does, then you realize that all of the meaning that you had once ascribed to your life, that you saw yourself as lacking, goes in the absence of existence.
If you'd like to get that bonus episode, you know what to do. Sign up to PPF Plus now. You will get all of our bonus episodes. You will get ad-free listening. You will get automatic sign-up to our newsletter. And you will be able to hear our discussion of It's a Wonderful Life. Just click on the link in the show description, go to our website, ppfideas.com. And of course, if you want to gift PPF Plus to someone else, you can still get Christmas gift subscriptions delivered on Christmas Day. So if there's someone you know who would like to hear about how It's a Wonderful Life is a film that's also about Sartrean existentialism and would like to listen to that episode after their Christmas lunch or Christmas dinner, you know what to do. Next time, in our regular slot, we're going back to the Regent Street Cinema, and I'm going to be talking with Lea Ypi about the film Rosa Luxemburg. That's next time. This has been Past, Present, Future.